This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 490 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Injuries play a huge role in this game about a game that we all love, but it's almost like we don't think enough about them. Like, we know when a player tears his ACL, he's done for the year, but we probably don't collectively think enough about the impact that hamstring pulls have, or high ankle sprains have. And then there's the big label of injury proneness that gets thrown around all the time, as if it's this thing that absolutely 100% exists. But we're not doctors, at least most of us aren't. So why are we creating these labels when we don't know if they should exist or not? That's where Edwin Porras comes in. Edwin is a doctor of physical therapy and he's a medical analyst for fantasypoints.com. I sat down with him to chat about whether or not injury proneness is actually a thing and how fantasy managers can take advantage of the idea of injury proneness. And then we dig into specific players for the 2021 season like Joe Burrow and Will Fuller. I know I learned something from talking to him, and I'm sure that you guys will too. Now, before getting into the interview, here at the Late Round Podcast, you know that we live and breathe football. But I think we can all agree that March belongs to basketball. And what better way to get caught up in the tournament action than with a huge new TV from Best Buy? Right now, you can find great deals on big screen TVs from brands like Samsung and LG. Best Buy will even bring it to you with fast, free curbside pickup and delivery. So go visit bestbuy.com today. Now let's listen to why injury proneness may not be as much of a thing as you think. So you wrote a two-part series over on fantasypoints.com called Injury Proneness is a Lie. What was it that made you want to write those articles, and how big of an edge is there for fantasy managers to properly understand this concept of injury proneness?
Yeah, man. So essentially I wrote this article because the bottom line is there's a 2.3% injury-free rate of games in the NFL. There's a study published from 2012 to 2014. And literally only 2.3% of them were injury-free. So everybody gets injured. So injury prone in and of itself is just, not real. But the reason I wrote it for fantasy players was because I found there wasn't a lot of information out there beyond like that was an ACL tear or that was a high ankle sprain. That's information that's going to be out there. Shefty's going to tweet it within like 16 hours, right? It doesn't really help anybody. So I wanted to take it a little further beyond that to help people sort of dissect their drafts. And another reason is fantasy managers I think they just misuse the term and they approach it. They approach drafts sort of on levels that are extreme. So they're either super, super wrongly calling players injury prone. I think of like 2020 Carson Wentz, even though that was a dumpster fire on its own because of his play. But Chris Carson's another one who I think he gets slapped with that injury prone label. And they were fine. I mean, generally speaking, Carson was fine. Both of the Carsons were fine. Or they go like the other way. And I feel like 2019 Gurley, AJ Green, 2020 Julian Edelman, David Johnson. To me, a lot of those players were sort of not really worth further investment. But dudes and ladies either are extreme. They're like, I write that player off completely, or they're trying to ride a train that isn't really riding anymore, if that makes sense. So anyway, moral of the story is that there's a lot of gray, and I wanted to give sort of a tangible understanding of what that gray is. And so that it's not just injuries are random and out of my control. I feel like that's not very helpful.
Yeah, so that's at a high level, the 2.3% number that you threw out there, which is really, really interesting. That's at a high level, but when does injury history matter for a player, if at all? Maybe it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think injury history sort of always matters, or at the same time never matters. It just depends. I know that's a really weird way to look at it, but you have to look at injuries, I think, in my opinion, about recurrence and performance. Like they matter when they're going to recur, and they matter when they're going to specifically impact performance. So you think about something like an Achilles injury or an older player with like an ACL tear. Those are catastrophic injuries that are probably not going to lead to good performance. They're not. I mean, the data shows they're not going to lead to good performance. You also think of recurrent injuries like concussions and hamstrings, like, Will Fuller and Cooks. We're going to get to Fuller in a little bit, but Fuller and Cooks, like concussions and hamstrings. That's when performance is impacted and availability in general. But another common phrase that I think I've seen a lot of too when it comes to injury histories is, they're coming off of the surgery or they're coming off of the injury. And that sort of makes sense, but I think it's a little too blanket still. I think 27-year-old Lamar Miller in 2019 coming off an ACL and meniscus is an appropriate time to say, oh, they're coming off an injury. But I don't think a 23-year-old Saquon Barkley, literal generational talent is an appropriate time to use that phrase.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then so right now we're sitting in a time where we're doing a lot of prospecting and looking at college athletes that are entering the NFL. And obviously I'm looking at my prospect models at running back and wide receiver. And one of the topics that I talked about actually last week on the Late Round podcast was about wide receiver BMI. So I'm curious, does the size of a player, like his BMI, does that matter when you're looking at these injuries?
You crushed that episode, by the way. I listened to that. That was good.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really good. So you sort of nailed it, I think, when you were talking about, you just have to worry about performance first. There's a big study of 550 NFL players, literally NFL wide receivers, who another PT, shout out at the real Adam_H, Adam Hutchison put this out, and he basically showed that regardless of BMI, there's no statistical significance in injuries for wide receivers. So BMI basically doesn't matter. If they're not at a high BMI or at the threshold that they need to perform, you need to worry about performance before you even worry about, injuries. And even when you go back and calculate for injuries, there's no difference in games missed for BMI in any wide receiver bucket. And then you think of running backs. There's another study done on 275 NFL running backs over a 10-year period. If those running backs were between 29 and 32 kilograms per meter squared, that's just BMI, between 29 and 32, there was also no difference in games missed. So when it comes to BMI, I think it's just overstated. It can matter in certain instances, but if you look at it one way, I think higher BMIs get sort of a bad rap. But when you're at a higher BMI, technically you have more, bone density, which means you might get injured less. But other than that, I think you should look at positional demands instead. You should look at pass catchers and how they have more ACL tears, hamstring strains, concussions. Running backs have high ankles and shoulders. So BMI is more of a question of, are they at the threshold to even perform? And I think you nailed that one.
Okay, I got you. So are there then specific injuries? You just mentioned some injuries that fantasy managers seem to overstate or understate when they happen. Someone tears an ACL, everyone freaks out. Someone has an Achilles injury. That's always been one that fantasy managers like myself or fantasy analysts are always worried about. Are there specific injuries, though, that we do end up overstating or understating when they occur?
Yeah, I think that I really like this question because it allows me to address sort of like the Carson Wentz syndrome. People typically overstate random collections of injuries that really don't matter. So Carson Wentz, right? He had the ACL, the concussion, the back, the wrist. Those are all sort of, and that wasn't even the timeline that it came in. But none of that really mattered. It didn't really correlate. You also think of a random collection of injuries. You think of Matthew Stafford, Keenan Allen, who had a lacerated kidney, an ACL, an AC joint. None of those things early on in their career tend to matter. I think we're going to look back on Wentz if he sort of sticks it out there. And moves forward and is actually, productive. We're going to be like, oh, that was funny. We called him injury prone. But in terms of generally understated, I think concussions are taken seriously, but I still think they're understated. Just because you have, a history of being okay with, one concussion doesn't mean you're actually at an increased risk. You're at double the risk to get another concussion. So, and that's the thing, is that the concussion protocol isn't as sensitive as we like it to be. It's not perfect. So even if players aren't reporting symptoms or they pass it through the protocol, that doesn't mean that they didn't have technically have a concussion. And then in terms of in-season management, high ankle sprains are definitely understated. The first week back, I did a study on 60, pretty small study, but it's 60 players. And essentially the first game back, they had about a 15% drop in fantasy points. So that matters for cash players, especially high stakes players. You definitely I don't think that a high ankle sprain, playing a player through a high ankle sprain when you're trying to go for ceiling is a smart thing to do. And then hamstring strains in season, there's about a 15% recurrence rate in the season. So there are some of the injuries that I think aren't necessarily appropriately framed. I think people just forget about them or they want to overlook them.
Yeah, I almost think that people look at that stuff in too much of a binary way. In a high ankle sprain, for instance, we see this injury happen. Someone's out for 4 weeks or whatever, and then they come back, and we assume that when a player comes back, he's 100%. What didn't Alvin Kamara have that a couple years ago? Whenever he was that was a good example of clearly you could just watch the guy and you could see that he was hindered in some way. But I think that we just look at games played and we say, oh, he was on the field, therefore he must have been healthy. But it just seems like we don't take that into consideration enough. I don't know if you've seen that or not.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree, dude, because there is actually a study done. It was 2013. I wish I could remember the name of the authors. It was on NFL high ankle sprains. And all 32, like, first of all, think about the last time you heard anybody agree on something consensus, more than like two people, right? So all 32 NFL team physicians in the study agreed, even though players come back in about 15 days from high ankle sprains, that they all consensus said that it takes 4 to 6 weeks for it to completely resolve. And so think about all the players that came back even just last year, Josh Jacobs, Raheem Mostert, before the 5-6 week mark, and they're still sort of struggling through those injuries. So I think you nailed it.
All right, so with all this being said, how do you think fantasy managers can sort of best take advantage of this injury proneness argument?
Dude, I love that you asked this because I feel like it's just the same as any other inefficiency. You've identified an inefficiency. You're like the master of identifying inefficiencies. That's like your shtick, right? You identify inefficiencies and you exploit them. So just think about seasonal examples like hamstring data, right? There's a 20% recurrence in the calendar year, 15%, like I mentioned, in season rate. Like that's going to matter the wide receiver's first game back, right? You probably shouldn't play or start a wide receiver, use a wide receiver in a lineup that you're trying to go for ceiling after they're coming off their first week with a hamstring strain. I already talked about the 15% dip for high ankle sprains. You find the same thing with hamstrings, but the difference is that with hamstring injuries, players tend to come back too soon or they'll try to play through it. So, I mean, the classic example is 2019 Adam Thielen. He was out for like 5 or 6 weeks after that. Keenan Allen, when he played that Thursday night game, he was definitely not going to. I told the Fantasy Points subscribers in the chat, like, don't play Keenan Allen because of the hamstring strain. Week 1 in 2020, Mike Evans, he did the same thing. So basically, I know that it's really difficult to not start your studs, but when you look at the big picture, the best place to exploit these market efficiencies is really like in DFS. When you are, the start your studs argument, I totally get it. In DFS, this works. You can exploit it in DFS if you're in cash games, small pools. But the start your studs, I think that this is the one argument for season long where I would argue you might actually not be hitting your ceiling if you start your studs coming off a hamstring or a high ankle sprain.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So let's look at a few players now as we enter the 2021 season who have some injury concerns. We can't get to all of these guys, but I tried to highlight some that a lot of listeners might have questions about. So let's start with Joe Burrow, because obviously quarterback affects the rest of his offense tremendously. Should we be concerned about Joe Burrow and his mobility? Because he's someone who I'm just generally interested in because of his situation, the fact that he can be mobile when he's healthy. He had a low touchdown rate last year, so there's some positive regression coming. Is he going to be healthy to start the season, though?
Good question. So you're talking to the rehab expert who should know the answer, right? So Here's the thing. This injury was nasty. It was bad. And that typical player comes back from an isolated ACL in 10 months. A good example is Preston Williams. He came back in like 9.5, 10 months, and it was still borderline whether he was going to play in week 1 or not, just in 2020. So Burrow is going to deal with the same thing. His positional demands are lower, but his injury was a lot more catastrophic. And so 45% of these players never even come back. So the first thing we have to worry about is, will Joe Burrow actually start the season on the PUP? That's still a concern. And then when he comes back, there's actually a lot of studies published on the psychology of players. And yeah, even if he's back 100% physically, there's a psychological aspect that's probably going to make him skittish in the pocket the same way Alex Smith was. So I would definitely be at least concerned or aware of the mobility issues if you're trying to decipher between Joe Burrow and another player.
So frustrating. So on the same team, though, what about Joe Mixon, who dealt with that injury? He was seemingly going to come back every single week throughout the second half of the season. Never came back. What is the deal with Joe Mixon? Is he fine? Is Joe Mixon okay?
I think Joe Mixon's fine, man. So just to wrap it up with Mixon, because I don't want to belabor the point here. He played 93% of his games in college before 2020. 93% of games in his career. He has a small concussion history, and what we know about the foot is that it was stable. He hasn't had surgery. He didn't have surgery. He didn't have any procedures. It was a stable fracture. And there are systematic reviews, high-level systematic reviews, looking at athletes with these foot issues. And if it's a stable either fracture or sprain, they can rehab it conservatively and be just fine. Like, there's no impact. I think from a health perspective, Mixon's another dude that gets lumped in with, he's injury prone, but he's definitely going to be somebody that I'm going to have on a lot of my rosters.
Okay, well, that's good to hear. At least there's some positivity out of Cincinnati. What about a guy who has not been able to stay healthy to start his career, who seems to have up. I mean, we saw a glimpse of it to start last year, but that's Paris Campbell. What can you say about him?
Yeah, dude. So Paris Campbell, right? We have to back up and think about just what are predictors for future health. And the best predictor for future health, according to another systematic review that I'm talking about here, is how many games did they play in college? What injuries did they have in college? And after his freshman year, Paris Campbell played 12 games, 13 games, and 14 games. He's got a track record of staying healthy. He's had a hodgepodge of injuries, the Carson Wentz syndrome I mentioned earlier, a foot fracture. Those tend to heal. Those happen in players that are around his age. The groin strain, players come back from groin strain surgery really, really, really well. They bounce back perfectly fine. And then he had the PCL. The only thing I would worry about with Paris Campbell is the workload issue. If his body isn't yet adjusted to doing the full-time grind of an NFL season after coming off of rehab, then he might have some soft tissue issues. But moving forward, man, I really think that I'm going to have a lot of Paris Campbell on my rosters.
That sounds like a good buy low situation from a dynasty perspective too, because I feel like he's one of those guys that a lot of people are just generally not on because of the quote injury history. But that's good news for him. Another player who, and I only have a couple more to go through, but another player who this past season, just got a lot of criticism in general because he would start games and everyone was using him in DFS and in season long, and then he just didn't finish them and he would get hurt early, which gave you that goose egg. But that's Deontay Johnson. Is there anything to worry about with Deontay Johnson?
Man, I just created an entire new syndrome here on the podcast with you. And it's the Carson Wentz syndrome, apparently, because that's what he has. Yes. Hamstring, back, toe, knee. None of those are correlated. Ankle. He, in college, played 11 games, 14 games, 13 games, the same thing as Paris Campbell. I won't belabor the point. I won't, drag this out. Deontay Johnson's, he's going to be fine. And I'm also going to have a lot of Deontay Johnson on my roster.
The last guy I got to talk about, who probably is at the top of the list in terms of injury proneness and the way that people view injury proneness, Will Fuller. Is Will Fuller injury prone?
Here's where I'm going to hedge. I don't know. Okay. But I feel like me saying I don't know is a lot less extreme than the people who are ready to jump on the Will Fuller's injury prone train. Here's the thing. Will Fuller, the same thing. We just talked about Deontay and Paris Campbell. He played literally every game when he was at Notre Dame. He had no hamstring issues. I don't see any injury history from his high school. I have no idea why all of a sudden he got to the NFL, things changed. He started having hamstring strains. So he's got a good history. Like, history is actually on his side. And this year, I think, hear me out, right? I know the PED stuff, but when it comes to like a physiological perspective, there's no data or any real evidence, empirical evidence that shows any of the banned substance lists that he was taking will actually help him specifically with hamstring strains. Like if he was, I don't know, trying to gain muscle mass or something, like, yeah, and he took PEDs, whatever. But I don't know how anything on that substance list, banned substances, would have kept him healthy. You also hear reports that he was changing his running mechanics. He changed his strength and conditioning routine. He changed his diet. Like basically that coming back to my answer. I don't know. Because there were so many confounders there. Like you can't point to the PEDs and be like, that's why, because he did so many other things. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm
willing to give Will Fuller another chance because last time I checked, this was last week, he was like wide receiver 41 or something. I'll take that all day. So that's my answer. That's my hedge. I don't know.
So who then, I'll end on this. Who's one player that you're going to draft a lot this year based mostly on the fact that you'll get an injury discount on him when there shouldn't be a discount?
I think Evan Ingram at this point. He's another dude that you really looked at early in his career as concussions, MCLs, foot. He's coming off the Liz Frank, but it's going to be his second year back. We know there's a 20% drop in production in offensive players when they have a Liz Frank injury. The second year they bounce back, that he's going to be in his second year from that. He low key, even though he had a lot of dropsies and he didn't do very, that offense is what it is, obviously. But his production drop was like 40% compared to his career average. He averaged 6.8 points per game. And at least some of that had to have been because of the foot and hit not being fully healthy. I think given his price tag at this point and the way people view him and how they view him as injury prone, I think he's a steal. I think he's an absolute steal.
Awesome stuff, Edwin. Really appreciate you hopping on and dropping some knowledge for everyone today. For those of you who aren't connected with Edwin, you should go follow him on Twitter at FBInjuryDoc. He's always tweeting really helpful information. And you can follow me on there as well at Late Round QB, and make sure you're subscribed to the Late Round Podcast so you never miss a show. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.